Welcome, everyone. We're live again. Today we have a very special guest, someone I um, was was pointed to by one of my followers, and since then have. Oh, wait a minute! I didn't mute my other computer. Now I got an echo. Um, so someone I really wanted to talk to. I saw that he wrote a couple of books. Um, some people pitched me parts of those books, and some very nice quotes were in there. So our guest today is Professor Ryan Cragun.
Hello, how are you?
So we're doing fine.
Good.
What I did forget is, how do we address you? Do we address you as Professor, Mr. Cragun? What would you prefer?
My students call me Dr. Cragun. Everybody else, I am Ryan. It's fine.
Okay, Ryan, welcome on our little channel. So my first question to pretty much every guest is, what do you believe and why? When it's an atheist, and I know that there's a theist past,
Sure.
I usually ask, so what happened? How did you become an atheist, and what were you before?
Right. Yeah, I'm happy to tell this. I've described this kind of passage in this process in several of my books. So I'm originally from Utah, and of course, the immediate first question I get is, are you Mormon, or were you Mormon? I was. So I was raised Mormon in a smallish town in Utah, so a very, very small town. My entire family was Mormon. Almost everybody in the community was Mormon. Back when I was growing up, it was about 89% LDS or Mormon. So it was a very kind of close-knit community. We knew all the non-Mormons, but everybody else was Mormon. Remained Mormon all the way up until I was 19 and ended up serving a Mormon mission. I spent 2 years in Costa Rica, picking up Spanish and trying to convert people to Mormonism. My mission basically changed my life trajectory. Before that, I wanted to be a medical doctor for various reasons, but after my mission, I became convinced that I had to figure out this religion thing. Either it was the greatest thing on the planet, and I had to tell everybody, and I have a journal actual entry writing this down, or it was the greatest fraud ever propagated upon humanity. So I was kind of torn at that point, right? I was still a believer. I was still a member of the church. I was still going regularly, but I clearly had some concerns, and I was trying to figure it out. That changed my trajectory from pre-med as an undergrad into the social sciences, basically. I went into psychology because there wasn't much sociology of religion where I was going to school at the University of Utah, studying everything I could about religion from a social scientific standpoint, and then eventually went to graduate school to continue doing that. I lasted about a year in graduate school studying sociology before it ended. But there are very specific things that happened there, and I'm happy to share those if it's of interest. I would say it was two kind of competing things, well, three probably, that contributed to me eventually realizing, like, I don't believe this anymore. One, I was being trained in empiricism, right? So I was being trained to become a scientist, to gather data, to use data to test hypotheses, which ran counter to the emotional epistemology that I'd been raised with Mormonism. And there's a fun story that goes with that. One of my closest friends in graduate school, his name's Dean, really bright guy, good friend still. He grew up a conservative Christian, right? And was still actually a conservative Christian, but he was about at the same stage I was in the process of extricating himself from religion. And we were, we'd gotten to know each other fairly well. It was a couple of months into our first year of graduate school when he told me this story, which I think is delightful. He said when he was an undergraduate, he had Mormon missionaries come talk to him about Mormonism. And they went through, all of the discussions, that's what they call them, all their lessons. and asked him to read the Book of Mormon. And kind of one of the key things that they want you to do is they want you to pray to God to see if the Book of Mormon is true. It's a form of emotional epistemology. And so Dean did it, right? As a devout, conservative Christian, evangelical Christian, he was like, I'm going to do it. And so he did. Missionaries came back a week later, and they asked him, Dean, did you read? And he's like, yeah, I read the passages you wanted. Did you pray about it? He's like, I did. And they said, did you get an answer? He's like, yeah. God told me that the Mormon Church is a cult and that the Book of Mormon is not true. And that, of course, was not what they were expecting. But when Dean told me that, right, I was still a member of the church, and I was like, oh, how do I respond when this is a close friend, a sincere individual? I really like him. I value my friendship. I trust him. Maybe the problem is not with Dean. Maybe the problem was with the epistemology, right, with the way of knowing. And that started me down that path, along with the training I was getting in Pearson's and some other stuff, to where by the end of my first year in graduate school, I was like, yeah, the Book of Mormon is really flawed. I don't know that there's any evidence for any of this stuff. So I initially just rejected the Book of Mormon, but the Bible followed fairly quickly after that because it's got just as many problems, if not more. So within, I'd say, 3 or 4 months of deciding I was no longer a Mormon, I was also an atheist, and then I found humanism shortly thereafter that. So I now identify as both an atheist and a humanist.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But you took it a little further than usual is the case. You wrote a couple of books as well.
Sure. So I continued. I mean, what I was studying in graduate school, I was in sociology, right? Which is the study of human social life. I had said from the get-go that I was interested in religion. So that was my area. My advisor in graduate school is a fairly well-known sociologist of religion, Reese Williams, who's now at the University of Loyola, Chicago. So, I mean, it took me about a year to figure out for myself that I didn't believe, right? That I kind of worked through those issues. But the sociology of religion is a really, like well-developed, complex field that tries to understand religion as a sociological phenomenon. And, just a year of graduate school is not going to teach me all of that, not even close. So I continued down that path, studying sociology. It was another 5 years before I got my PhD. And my research looked specifically at people who leave religions. I was very much studying myself. But I've continued down that path, right? So I continue to study the sociology of religion, though it's a little bit of a misnomer because the areas where I continue to do research is Mormonism. So I continue to maintain an interest in Mormonism, but I also study the non-religious, and I use that as a blanket term, even though it's probably not perfectly accurate, but to describe people who have no religious affiliation, but I would also include among them agnostics and atheists and humanists and brights and all the other derivations of people who are non-believers or non-religious. So I study that, but I also, maintain a general interest in the sociology of religion. I've continued to do stuff on religion generally. And the books that I've written, which is 3 or 4 now, one of them, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should, was very much designed to bring the findings of the sociology of religion to a general population. And then the one that followed that, How to Defeat Religion in 10 Easy Steps, was again another attempt to take the ideas in the sociology of religion and use them actually to kind of flip that question on its head and say, well, a lot of these people are studying how to strengthen religion. What could we learn from the sociology of religion to actually weaken fundamentalist religion? Because I do have very nuanced views on religion.
So I guess I have one question. Have you gotten reviews from religious people who have read your books, and have you given you some feedback? What has been their response?
No, I mean, unfortunately, right, at some level, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, to use a religious reference.
Right.
Not a lot of people are willing to kind of cross that aisle and take a look at the things that I've written. Now, admittedly, like What You Don't Know About Religion But Should, that was written for a general audience. It wasn't supposed to be targeted towards the non-religious or atheist or anything like that. That's written for everybody. The second one, How to Defeat Religion in 10 Easy Steps, was very much meant to be targeted towards secular activists, right?
which I have read, and I found it fascinating.
Yeah, so that book was very much meant for that audience. So I would be surprised if anybody who's religious would read that, right? It's not meant for them. I mean, they're welcome to read it. I
can see why an evangelist would read it.
Yeah.
I've done street evangelism in the past myself, and a book like that I would really zero in on to see what the other side was saying, their strategy to be able to counter that. So to a certain subsect of the fundamentalist cultures or subcultures, right. I'd say it might hold their interest for a little bit until their heads exploded from anger.
Yeah, and I think I even mentioned that at the beginning, right? That I'm kind of giving away, like, here's what we could do to weaken fundamentalist religion. And if they read it, they would see, like, we're actually headed down that path. So they would get our game plan, basically. But I don't know that many have read it. I mean, certainly they haven't given me reviews, negative reviews on Amazon. My reviews are generally positive, but it's because I'm preaching to the choir.
My guess is many of them don't know that it even exists. I mean, they're so busy with things like, the God Delusion and other really high-profile books that they just love to hate.
Yeah, and that's fine. I don't mind, right? I mean, part of what drives me to write is that I like to write. So if they don't sell 1 million copies, it's not the end of the world. I have a great day job, right? Those were actually both written at night, literally at night. I used caffeine to stay up late at night to write those. But I publish lots of research, and anybody can check out my professional website, ryantcragun.com. And I've got dozens of peer-reviewed articles in academic journals that's my primary focus, right? These other things, this is my kind of attempt at academic activism. But most of my research, most of my time is spent, teaching. That's what I do. I do that all day long. I oversee programs. I do a lot of research that is, published in academic journals. That's my primary focus. This stuff was kind of side interest stuff that was fun. It was really enjoyable to write.
It's enjoyable to read.
Well, thank you.
Okay, but do you get any other responses than just the reviews on Amazon? Do you get
like critical feedback or anything?
Critical, but maybe what would be good is getting positive feedback that people read the book and it definitely made a change for them.
Sure. I mean, there's a fair amount of positive feedback. I wouldn't say I have hundreds of reviews, but some have, a dozen plus reviews, generally very positive. I mean, the first book that I mentioned, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should, the fun part about it is just filled with data, right? I'm trained in quantitative data analysis, so I like numbers. I put lots of numbers in the stuff that I write. And that book is just filled with figures and data and graphs from openly accessible data sources, so anybody could download the same data sets and see what I wrote. So it's going to be very hard to challenge the findings of that book because it's data, right? It's empirical data that are kind of easily accessible, anybody could look at. So you may not like how I interpret certain things, but you can't really challenge the numbers because the numbers are the numbers, right? And that's part of why I did it, is like, here are the numbers, right? And we can certainly talk about some of the chapters in there if you want, but that was the idea. So for the most part, no, the reviews have been very, very positive. People like it. I've presented to a number of groups. Again, I do this occasionally on weekends or evenings. I did one just this past weekend where I will go out into the community and talk to different secular groups. Unitarian churches usually have me because they're very open-minded about these things.
Okay, and so what I would like to know is what's your favorite part in the books that you have written so far?
Ooh, I can tell you,
and why?
Sure. Were you going to ask something else?
Yeah, what's your favorite part and why?
Oh, and why? In the How to Defeat Religion in 10 Easy Steps book, I have a chapter on syncretism. That is usually one that I present when I go to these local groups, because most people don't know what the term is, right? So it's a term that comes from religious studies, excuse me, and refers to the kind of co-opting of elements of religion from one religion to another religion. All religions have done this, right? All religions are syncretistic. Many of the characteristics of Jesus, for instance, have been stolen from other religions, right? So Jesus being born of a virgin comes from different gods from the time period and predating that. Jesus being raised up into heaven, Jesus being the sun god, like all of these aspects of Jesus are being basically syncretistic. They've been stolen from other religions. And so in that chapter, I say if we are really interested in weakening religion and defeating fundamentalist religion, we're much better off syncretizing aspects of modern life than we are trying to destroy them. Right. So the example that I give is whether or not you like Christmas as a secular individual, whether or not you celebrate it, you're not going to get rid of it. Christmas,
so make an atheist nativity.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like it's so deeply enmeshed in the US, but also in most of the Western world, that like attacking Christmas feeds right into the stereotype of atheists as being angry individuals, right? Like, wow, we hate Christmas or whatever. And like, it makes no sense to do that. It's a really stupid move. And so the argument that I make is in that chapter, we need to be at least as smart as religious people if our goal is to actually weaken fundamentalist religion. And so what we should be doing is syncretizing. We should be taking Christmas and divorcing all of the religious elements out of it. So let's get rid of all of the religious stuff out of it and turn it into a completely secular holiday. And then we out Christmas the Christians, right? So we take all of the kind of Christmas music, right? We rewrite the lyrics to make them universally approved, so everybody loves the lyrics. And I actually do this with Silent Night in the book in a very positive, loving way. So we're basically just pulling all of the religion out of the holidays and making them secular holidays. And then what we've done is we've syncretized the different aspects of religion. The fun part is I think some of the national secular groups have read this and they've realized that I was probably right. So you don't find, and I don't mean to single somebody out, maybe he did it for other reasons, right? But David Silverman doesn't go on Fox News around Christmas anymore and getting screaming matches about how stupid Christmas is. They don't insult people who are celebrating Christmas anymore. They basically put up really nice signs. It's like, we celebrate Christmas too. Let's have a great time. And that undermines the stereotypes of angry atheists, right? It makes us into just normal people who just celebrate things differently. And that's very intentional, right? I think if we do this even more intentionally, then again, we can weaken the hold of fundamentalist religion in society. So that's one of the chapters that I actually really like, and I think it's very easily implemented at an individual level, at a local level, and even at a national level. So
I think it makes some of them mad, considering some of the feedback that some atheists get. I can't speak for, every atheist or every Christian. Some atheists who do celebrate Christmas, like myself, we get such comments as, you're an atheist, you can't celebrate Christmas, you can't enjoy this. You want to be an atheist? Well, then you don't get to enjoy Christmas. And I just tell them, I do what I want.
Yeah.
Period.
That's it. I mean, that's how easy it is to say, right? Like, I do celebrate Christmas. I have a Christmas tree, right? We do all sorts of things. We have, Christmas gifts that we do. We don't do a lot of them, right? But we do Christmas gifts. We get together with family. We do all of those things. There's just no nativity. There's no discussion of Jesus. None of that happens because that's irrelevant for us.
I'll even put up a nativity, but I'll make it something else.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I do say we got to be careful with is the way we celebrate it should not be offensive to.
Right.
Right. We don't want to
make it more inclusive.
Because then we're just going to piss people off, right? The idea is to do it so discreetly, so carefully, that by the time Christmas is completely secularized, Christians don't even realize what has happened. If we do that, right, then we win this culture war.
Well, many of them did the same thing with the Christmas tree itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah, and that's the fun part. I live in Holland. I think approximately 80% of the population here is atheist,
Right.
or at least identifies as non-believing. Maybe that should be a better way to put it. So I grew up with Christmas not even knowing that it was a religious holiday. We had a Christmas tree. Santa brought presents, which I have to be thankful to my parents, because in Holland we have Santa's origin, which is Saint Nicholas, Sinterklaas, as he's called here. But he comes at in November, celebrates the day before his birthday. Everyone gets presents. That's 5 December. 6 December is his birthday, and then he goes back to Spain. And then a couple of weeks later, we have Christmas.
Right.
So presents again. I got the double whammy. I got the Dutch version, and I got the international version. But we never had the religious connotation. So to me, it's still very alien to see that happening in the US. And one of the things that stuck out for me was the riot about the Starbucks cups 2 years ago.
Joshua Feuerstein.
Yes. And I actually replied to that by making Starbucks cups, because that was the year Aaron Ra, Matt Dillahunty, and Seth Andrews had their unholy trinity. So I made Starbucks cups with the unholy trinity and sent those out to Aaron Ra, Matt Dillahunty, and Seth Andrews, who all of them posted it on Twitter and on Facebook. So that was my little piece of fame right there. But to me, that's completely alien that people can get that mad just about the design of a cup.
Seriously, have you ever heard of Mohammed cartoons?
Sure, but yeah, if not that I want to degrade anyone, but if you look to the Islamic countries, education isn't that great there. So I could see why religion plays a bigger role there. I have a friend my best friend is from Syria. He's a Christian. So we fight a lot about what's the correct position, but we're still friends. And but that also gives me the idea that where education isn't that great, religion has more power. And so it surprised me when I'm on the internet, I bumped into a video of Kent Hovind, and my jaw dropped. And I usually make fun and say, well, there's still a dent in the coffee table where my jaw landed. Because that, to me, that was a level of I couldn't say it in another word, a level of stupidity that I couldn't get. People who have access to a decent education and then see a grown man state the things that Hovind puts forward, and later I discovered Ken Ham, and that's what actually made me go on Twitter and try to battle this. And so Hovind was number one on my list. I ticked him off. So now the people of AIG. And I want to get back to Hovind because I want to do a series.
Peter has an Arya Stark list.
Yes. I have a bucket list, but then different than other people have. I want to talk to certain people just to know what makes them tick.
The tickler, the hound.
Yes. And I want to get back to Hovind to completely dissect the video that I saw, 100 things why evolution is stupid, and I want just to counter every single point that he makes in that video. And so,
well,
I didn't get it. An educated country like the US, where there was, to me, that was stunning. And then to learn that almost half of the people think that the world is 6,000 years old. That's something that I don't get. What do you think is the reason for that? Because the US isn't a third world country.
Right. You know, it's a little complicated, and if you don't mind, you know, adding some nuance to the conversation, I'm happy to go down that path a little bit. There are a couple of things to kind of recognize with the US, right? So, one, we're actually not as religious as a lot of people think we are. Even though, you know, a sizable percentage still identifies having religious affiliation. I actually just saw, before we came on the air, new study coming out suggesting that it's 34 to 35% of Americans are now non-religious. I mean, the numbers are really taking off, which is pretty fascinating. So that suggests like 60%, maybe a little bit higher, 65, are still identifying as having religious affiliation. But in any given week, only about 20% of Americans are going to religious services, right? So people may still identify as having a religious affiliation, but that doesn't mean they're going to church. It doesn't mean that they're actually following the teachings of their religion. Most Catholics still today, I mean, they have for decades, have said that they use birth control and they think priests should get married, right? So yes, they may identify as Catholic, but they don't ever go to church, and they don't live by the principles and the teachings of the religion. And actually, they disagree with many of them. So we have to recognize, yeah, we may be more religious than, say, Western Europe. And that's absolutely true, right? In Western Europe, attendance rates are like 1 to 4% on a given week. So we're like 5 times more religious in some sense.
Could I put in here with that statistic right there?
Sure, what's up?
Might that have some relation to one of the points you made in your 10 Ways to Defeat Religion, and that is to, instead of fighting against or fighting for the separation of church and state, actually merge them together? Does that have anything to do with this?
Oh, I think very much. Now, that position, right, which I state very clearly in the book, like, I think that's actually the better route. It's very unpopular in the secular community, right? So the secular community in the US is like, no, that is heresy. I should be burned at the stake for suggesting that we should actually have a closer relationship between church and state in the US.
It kind of goes with reverse psychology, though.
Well, I mean, it is, but if you look at the evidence, right, if we want to use empirical evidence, the countries that have had, and it's a little complicated today, so Christian countries in Western Europe, right, that have had a close alliance between church and state have much weaker churches today than we do.
Right.
And I think there are very specific reasons for that, right? Now, a lot of them have started to separate these out, right? So this has happened recently in Finland, right? They now, I mean, in the last 2 decades, they've split off, so now there is no longer a state church. They're kind of separate. But the argument that I've always given is, if you have a close alignment between church and state, and we recognize that it is the state that gives the church the right to exist, which means the state has the upper hand, right? And that's certainly true in the US. So as long as that is the case, that it's not the church giving the state the right to exist, which is the case in some countries, as long as it's the inverse, then whenever the state makes changes, like, say, gender equality, guess what the church has to do as well?
Oh.
So if the state says we want to legalize same-sex marriage, and the church is part of the state, guess what the church has to do? They have to legalize same-sex marriage. So in essence, the church is secularizing along with the state. So as the state becomes more progressive, the church is forced to do the same, and as a result, you get relatively weak churches, right? There are other factors that contribute into this. There's a whole kind of market economics approach, where if pastors are going to get paid whether or not people show up, then why would they put on an exciting service, right? I don't know that I buy that entirely, but I think there's some logic to it. There's a reason why our mega churches in the US are really exciting. I don't know if you've been to mega churches, right? Charis, I don't know if you have. I mean, you talked a little bit about your background. Peter, I don't know if you've ever been to a mega church, but boy, they're really exciting, very entertaining. And there's a reason for that, right?
I've seen services. So I'm aware a little bit. And
Sure.
they're actually building a mega church in Holland at the moment in the south, which seats, I think, 2,000 people. So that's a mega church in Holland.
In Holland. In the US, it's not. It doesn't meet our criteria.
Yeah, but that's just to give you some perspective.
Right.
That's a mega church here.
Yeah, US, that's like a large church. Mega church, we actually put the cutoff at 2,500. So they've got to have weekly attendance of 2,500 or we don't even count them as a mega church. Anyway, so I think there are lots of arguments there. The other point that I wanted to make about why the US looks more religious than a lot of other developed countries is we often think about the US as a country, right? As a single country, and we're really not. We're at a minimum 2 countries, right? But probably better kind of reason to be many countries. Compare Mississippi to Oregon, right? Those are not the same country. They may be legalistically one, part of the same nation state, but the people could not be more different. And so it shouldn't be surprising, right? When we think about the level of economic development in Mississippi, the culture in Mississippi, and I'm not trying to be mean to Mississippi, right? Like, Mississippi's a nice place. I've been there. And they're nice.
Didn't that one guy from the United Nations come through and do a tour, and Mississippi was one of those places he toured? Was it the UN or was it somewhere else? EU?
Could be. Oh. How far
You know
back?
what I'm talking about?
Are we talking about like revolutionary times?
No.
Or is it recent?
It is recent.
Okay, recent. Okay.
He was looking at the quality of, our, he was basically looking at homelessness in a supposedly rich country like the US.
Yeah, no, there's, I'm trying to think. There's a great book that I've been recommending to lots of people, Strangers in Their Own Land, and she makes the point that life expectancy in Louisiana, right, which is right next to Mississippi, is the same as life expectancy in Haiti, right?
Ooh.
But if you go to Massachusetts, right, our life expectancy in Massachusetts is just as high as most other countries in Western Europe, right? There's a 5-year gap in life expectancy between those 2 states. So there are states, kind of in the middle of the country, and particularly in the Bible Belt in the South, that are not really like the 2 coasts, right? And there are many, many reasons for that. We're not going to have to go down all of those paths, right? But look at where people are the most religious. It's in those states. You go to the coasts, right? And the coasts are remarkably non-religious. They look like the UK. They look like, well, maybe not quite Scandinavia yet, right? But they certainly look like France. They look like Germany, maybe even the Netherlands, right? So they look much more like the rest of the developed world than the middle of the country. And so I think it's important to recognize, like, there are at least 2 countries here, not just one big country. And then the last point that I'll make on this issue, which is the relationship between education and secularization. There is clearly evidence that the more education people get on average, the less religious they tend to be on average. However, it gets really complicated depending on which aspect of religiosity you're looking at. So people who make it through college, we'll just use college as our baseline, make it through college with their religious identity and beliefs intact, actually go to services more often. They're more civically engaged, and that's more civically engaged as far as voting, but also as far as like going to church and being members of their church and actively participating. So it has these weird effects, right? That you can get higher education and actually become more religious in certain dimensions of religiosity than in others. So it gets a little complicated. I don't want to say straight out like higher education will completely destroy people's belief. Turns out that's not necessarily true. It's
well,
more
especially in the engineering fields, I've seen that many people retain their religiosity versus, say, evolutionary biology and things that are relevant to beliefs. I mean, engineering, you're not going to get too many challenges to your beliefs, whether you're an atheist or the most devout theist there is. I mean, engineering is, I mean, you could have your PhD in some sort of engineering and not really meet too many challenges. Though an engineer, you know, to be fair, he should be the first one to be able to point out the flaws in the argument about the second law of thermodynamics, but that's for another topic.
Yeah, well, I should have been a little bit more nuanced when I made my remarks, because when it comes to the US, what I was addressing was young Earth creationism, that still has a large following in the US. And the sad part is that because of the money that's going into it, it started with Kent Hovind. Now it's Ken Ham. It's spreading across the world, because we have seen, actually Kent Hovind, one of his followers, started a website here in Holland. So there is a Dr. Dino website in Holland. The guy abandoned it when Hovind was sent to prison. I think for good reason, but it is still growing. So that part is growing, while religion in general is still on its decline.
I mean, belief in I don't
in Europe it is
growing in the US. I think it's at best staying level, but more likely it's declining slowly.
I think the amount of it is declining, but those who still hang on to it are becoming more intense.
Yeah, I think that's true. And they've certainly got resources. They've got way more resources than all of the big secular groups in the US combined, right? That's absolutely true. I was actually just talking to one of the leaders of the big secular groups in the US, who was detailing that combined, the big national secular groups in the US may have annual budgets close to $20 million, and Focus on the Family, just one evangelical group, has an annual budget in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So they're clearly outgunned, right? The secular groups and the evangelical groups have a very big vocal voice, and there are a variety of reasons for that we could talk about, including tax policy. So it sounds like they're loud, but they're actually losing. I mean, that's the fun part, is when you're into numbers, right? When you care about statistics and you understand how data are collected, right? It turns out they're losing lots of people. Evangelicals are shrinking in the US. Southern Baptists are literally losing as a percentage of the population in absolute numbers. So are Catholics now. All of the major religious groups are shrinking in the US. The only group that is growing is the non. That's it. That's the nuns.
So I was thinking, I think the situation with education in our country is similar with that of healthcare. In a country like the US, there exists some of the best healthcare in the world, and there exists some of the best education in the world. However, the distribution of that healthcare and education is where we're falling short. So masses of people in lower income areas of the country are losing out on critical healthcare, but also critical education that would, speed this process along that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, all the evidence supports that. So when and this is another chapter actually from my book. I mean, it sounds like you've read my book. How to defeat religion in 10 easy steps. One of the arguments that I make is, if we give people this life security, right, meaning we provide them with a social safety net, including healthcare and unemployment benefits and housing and food, if we take care of all of those things, the evidence seems to suggest that people will stop looking for next life or existential security, right? They'll find it here, and that kind of solves the problem, right? So that's another step that we can take. And as you just mentioned, Charis, that stuff is not equally developed and equally distributed in the US. We have very poor populations, we have very wealthy populations, we have very moderately to low educated populations, and we have highly educated populations. I was actually just talking to, I forget who it was, but we were talking about Secular Student Alliance, right? Which, great program. I think they're really valuable. Somebody had asked if we have one here at UT. I said, it's complicated. There are a lot of universities that don't actually need a Secular Student Alliance. I mean, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have them. I'm saying they don't need them. because students get there, right, your Ivy League schools in New England, and they realize that almost everybody's secular. They fit right in, right? So they're coming from Mississippi, where they're an embattled minority and people hate atheists, and then they get upstate Connecticut or, you know, upstate New York, and suddenly everybody is just like that. So they don't feel like they need the support that comes with a secular student alliance because everybody's secular. We really do live in two different countries.
So can I ask how that is on U of Tampa?
Sure.
Is that
that's a fair question.
Is that a topic on university?
I've heard Florida described as its own country because it is so weird in so many ways.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I'm not going to defend how weird Florida is, but Florida is like a microcosm of the US. You can think about it that way. So it's almost like there are two states here. There are the big cities. So you've got like your Miami-Dade region, you've got your Tampa Bay region, you've got Orlando, and then Gainesville, which is where the University of Florida is kind of, you know, it's like the big cities. And then Tallahassee is like the big cities. Jacksonville is one of the bigger cities, but it kind of goes both ways. So the big cities and kind of the coastal areas, they kind of look like New England or the upper eastern part of the US because so many people are transplants from there, right? So many people move down here. And that's true actually of our students here at the University of Tampa. More than 70% of our students come from at least 500 miles away, right? So we have a lot of international students, but we also have many students from the upper eastern part of the US. But the inner part of the state of Florida, the more rural area, that looks like any other part of the rural South, right? So you go inland from Tampa, and suddenly you get to, say, Lakeland, and Lakeland looks like rural Georgia. I mean, it's a little bit bigger than that, but you will find that. So Florida is kind of like a microcosm of the US in that there are parts that are very blue, very progressive, very kind of left-leaning, and then massive swaths that are red and conservative and very devoutly religious. Tampa happens to be one of the least religious metropolitan areas in the United States, despite being in Florida. And that's because it's a very metropolitan city, right? We have lots of people who are not from Florida, lots of transplants from the Northeast. And there's good education here, if I say so myself, but we have two big universities, right? Very well developed. And the university is actually, I've done surveys of our students here at the University of Tampa. The last survey I did was in 2013 of a representative sample of our student body, and only 4% would be classified as fundamentalist Christians. It's 4%, right? Compared to the national average, which is about 30%, 25 to 30%. So we're substantially less religious than most of the country, right? And particularly rural parts of Florida.
That is fascinating.
Fun stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we have a couple of people who are following us who are from Florida, so at least it's that to me was actually surprising, because what I get on Twitter is a completely different picture, but that could be because of the people that I'm talking to.
Yeah.
But yeah, at least that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, but I love data.
Yes, and I would love if you could link those studies to me. You mentioned earlier the study that there are more atheists or non-believers in the U.S. For people listening to this stream, I'd like to have those as links in the description, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
We will also link to you and to your books, of course. But that would be great to have as additional info for the people who are listening to the stream, because
sure,
those are questions that that pop up, and at least for me, being Dutch, it's quite hard to find accurate data in the US, because I'm not that familiar with which you can trust and where you might want to go for your data, because
Mhm. Well, I mean, I can give you a couple of very easy sources. Pew is actually pretty good, right? They've gotten a bad rap at times, and I've even been critical of them at times, but they've done a really good job. And actually, a lot of the people who work at Pew now, I know them. They come to my conferences. They have the same training that I do, so they are PhDs in the sociology of religion. And I hang out with them, right? Like, I know Conrad Hackett really well. He's got a huge Twitter following. You should actually follow Conrad Hackett on Twitter. He has hundreds of thousands of followers. He works at Pew, and he posts numbers all the time. So that's a shout out to Conrad, who's actually a really good guy. But he's a solid researcher, right? Greg Smith, also there, right? Bashir Muhammad. I know a number of the people at Pew. Their numbers are pretty good. They're not perfect, right? And I don't think they would claim they're perfect, but they're really pretty good. And then PRRI, so the Public Religion Research Initiative, I think is what it's called. I can again give a link to that. They're another polling outfit that's also pretty reliable. I cite their numbers fairly regularly. In my own research, both of those groups will occasionally make their data public, but the primary source that I use for my data is the General Social Survey, which is a large nationally representative sample that's done every 2 years roughly. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. It's run by the National Opinion Research Center out of the University of Chicago. It's probably the kind of gold standard for data collection and reliable data, not only in the US, but around the world. It is solid data. And so when I'm running numbers, that's actually what I use in my book, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. It's the General Social Survey. The data are just really, really solid. So we have some great reliable sources. Turn to any of those three, and you're not going to be wrong by much if you're wrong at all.
Okay. Well, it would be good to have those links and put them in the description. Not only just for us, but for people who are watching the stream and want to be on the mark with the current numbers. We also had a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll have to go back a little bit to what you said earlier about education and religion. How about well-being? What would you say? Would religion have an influence on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So, I mean, it's like $1 million question on this one. It depends on how you are defining well-being, what you understand by well-being, how you want to think about well-being, how religion is related to that, right? So the big name, and I'll throw his name out here because he's kind of the big name. And that may be shifting because he's getting a little older, but he's been the big name in well-being research for decades, is Ed Diener, Diener. For a long time in his research, he found that there were tiny but statistically significant relationships between people being religious and happiness or well-being. They're always like marginal, they're not meaningful differences, but they're statistically significant. But in the last 10 years, looking at international data, he's begun to realize that religion actually doesn't do anything for people's well-being. It's complicated, right? It's actually very complicated. It's complicated by how religious people are in the country on average, on the value of religiosity and being religious in a country. Both of those actually have more of an effect. So the value of how religious the country is, or how religious they think people should be, is actually more of an influence on the contribution to well-being than just being religious. So it's actually gotten really complicated and a little bit convoluted, but I think you could pretty safely today say that being religious is not going to make you happier than being non-religious. I think the numbers would pretty much be a wash. At best, there might be minor, marginal, maybe statistically significant effects, but it's not enough to make a bit of a difference in the grand scheme of things. So religion is not going to make you any happier than not being religious.
Oh, I asked this because we usually get the question or the remark that atheists must be miserable people because they lack God and they don't have Jesus. And I usually point them to studies that show that the more secular countries are the countries where the people are the most happy.
Yeah.
If recently there was a study done under children, and makes me a little bit proud that Dutch children score the highest on being the happiest on the planet. So, and all of that points towards the more secular countries.
Yeah, I mean, so it boils down again to how you measure it. So if we're looking at like quality of life, low crime rates, a sense of security, a sense of confidence, right? On all of those, yeah, secular individuals win, but that's a country level factor, right? So it gets a little complicated mathematically, but country level, certainly kind of Northwestern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, and even most of Western Europe. Australia, we should certainly throw in. Japan, we should throw in. New Zealand, we should throw in. All of those are actually doing really, really well if we're looking at kind of quality of life indicators. If it's happiness, it gets a little complicated, but that is actually at a kind of a country level, right? Any individual could be different, right? So if we think about it at an individual level, but there are some other things that I think are actually kind of fun. This came out in a discussion I was having just last week as well. Religious people often will say things like, oh yeah, you know, non-religious people must be angry and kind of sad and have a horrible existence. But when you look at one particular kind of facet of life that I think is really telling on this point, non-religious people are better at dying. And this is actually a chapter in my other book, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should. I talk about this, that non-religious people are better at dying and dealing with death, right? And why is that the case? Well, you know, everybody grieves. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're religious or not. You grieve, you go through a grieving process either when somebody dies, right, or when somebody dies. And then, of course, when your own death is pending, right, you have to deal with that as well. But with religious people, you have to tack on another layer of concern. And that layer of concern is not something that non-religious, non-believers have to deal with. And that's where you're going. Are you going up or are you going down, right? For atheists, like, that's an irrelevant question. We don't bother to ask it. It doesn't matter to us. So we just have the other issues of like my own mortality to deal with, or somebody else died, right? I don't have to worry about when my parents die, which they're alive and they're doing great, right? But when they do, I don't have to ask that question of like, are they going to heaven or are they going to hell? I don't care. It's irrelevant. It's not a question that I have to worry about. Religious people have to deal with that. Imagine, for instance, if it's your kid, right? So your own child dies. Like, that's a horrible thing. And I have a child and I would hate for that to happen to anybody. But for me, I don't have to deal with the idea of where my child is going, right? I don't have to. My child is gone and that's horrible. And I will get through it and I will grieve. But then I get through it and I don't ever have to think about, did they go to heaven or hell? Irrelevant.
Yeah.
On that topic of the well-being of atheists, down on a little bit more of an individual level, the individual atheist, I guess individual atheists in general. So, you know, we make the observation, it's commonly known that those in massive majority atheist countries do fairly well. The atheists in those countries do well. Right. When theists make the, try to make the statement that, atheists here just seem so angry, it should occur to them that that is actually a statement against them. If atheists in this country are faring considerably worse than in other countries, that should open their eyes to the treatment of atheists in general here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. We do see that. I mean, some of my own research I've published on discrimination against atheists. If you identify as non-religious, right, you're actually less likely to experience discrimination than if you identify as an atheist. Mm-hmm. So, if somebody asks, what's your religion? If you're not in a safe place, right, like, you're much better off saying, I'm just not religious, right? But if you say you're an atheist, you are inviting persecution in the US. We still retain a general sentiment that it's good to be religious. I think that's changing. I think it's changing quite rapidly, and that's a good thing. But that's absolutely true, right? We've seen this with racial minorities, with sexual and gender minorities, that the daily stresses that they have to deal with worsen their quality of life. So the fact that we don't see huge differences in quality of life and happiness and subjective well-being between, say, atheists and theists in the US kind of fascinating in its own right? We would expect there to be huge differences because of the discrimination that they experience. And I think it gets complicated for a variety of reasons, but those differences don't really exist. They're not there.
It might depend on the part of the country too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very valid point.
Yeah, and you mentioned how people view atheists.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard from a lot of followers, and I'm actually helping a few of them cope with what they're going through. Is how they are viewed. I actually have a young girl who came to me with some serious problems that she encountered on the streets and in school. What do you think would be necessary or would be useful to change the image of how atheists are viewed in the US? And
Sure.
I'm not talking in general here, but I'm talking about the really bad parts, because they do exist, and we do see people suffering there.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, there certainly continues to be discrimination against atheists. There's plenty of prejudice against atheists, right? In order to change that, I'm going to draw to a certain extent on the work of Will Gervais, who's a psychologist. He's a social psychologist, experimental psychologist at the University of Kentucky, who's done some really good work on this. One of the things that he found that actually lessens prejudice towards atheists is, and he did this in experimental design, so we don't really know how well that translates outside of the lab, but if you increase the percentage of the population that people think are atheists, then suddenly prejudice goes down, right? So if people think like atheists make up a tiny percentage of the population, like, oh yeah, we hate those people. But as you increase that to a sizable percentage to where there's a pretty good chance they're going to run into an atheist, suddenly they're like, oh yeah, I'm okay with atheists, right? I don't have a problem with that. So one of the implications is that atheists need to be out, as long as they're safe, right? And I get, like, that's always a caveat, right? As long as it's safe to be out. It's part of the reason why I'm out as an atheist, right? Now, I don't run around as like, I'm an atheist, this is the most important part of my identity, right? I have values that I care about, but I'm not going to hide that. And part of that is I'm a very privileged individual, right? So I'm a heterosexual white male, right? In a tenured position at my university. I don't need to hide that. I can take the kind of arrows that come my way and provide cover for other people. So part of it is we need to be out, right? The other part that I think can help reduce the prejudice is to be good people. Just be nice, right? I love to tell a story about this involving my next door neighbor, who's a great person, right? When we moved here to Tampa, it was 11 years ago now, we bought a house, moved in, right? And my next door neighbor, turns out he's a really cool guy. He's a great guy. We got to know each other, just, you know, doing yard work, whatever, we'd talk and so on. But religion never came up, right? Which is, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, it didn't come up in the South. No, it didn't. It didn't come up. And I would notice, because this is what I studied, like his truck stayed in his driveway on Sundays. He wasn't going to church, right? But I didn't care, right? Like, I wasn't going to bring it up. It was probably 5 years of us knowing each other. Like, I'd like to bake, so I'd take him cookies, right? And you know, we got to know each other on a friendly basis. We were talking one day, and he's like, oh, you know, something's going on, such and such. And I said, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I won't be here. I'm going to be out of town. He's like, oh, where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm speaking at a conference in Texas. He's like, oh, what conference? I said, oh, it's the American Atheist Conference. He's like, oh, are you an atheist? I was like, yeah, you know, I'm an atheist. It's like, I had no idea. I didn't know you were an atheist, right? Now, it didn't change our relationship. And that's the beauty of this, right? He didn't care, because he had, over 5 years, gotten to realize, like, I'm not a jerk. I'm a nice person. I bake him cookies, right? We're friendly. We talk to each other all the time. By the time he found out that I was an atheist, me being an atheist didn't matter anymore. Which means, what have I done? My next door neighbor, next time somebody says, oh, those atheists, right? They're evil. They eat their babies, right? Like, all of this stuff. He's like, what? My next door neighbor's an atheist. And so is his wife.
Yeah.
and so is his kid, right? We're not angry atheists. We're not evil people. We're just regular people trying to be good, right?
The fact that that has to be said is telling of our culture, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But there are things we can do, right? We can actively be involved in doing this. Just be good people, right? I think that's a really important thing, and this actually goes back to something that David Silverman said, which I again, this is props to David Silverman. He said at that very conference that he wanted to be known as the angry atheist, because if he's the angry one, guess what we can be? We can be the nice ones. We can be the friendly atheist, right? So I think he's toned down his rhetoric a little bit over the years, and maybe it wasn't working as well as he thought.
I think him and Meta is the friendly atheist.
He is. I mean, he's got that market cornered, right? But I think we can all do our own part of just like being good people. And then when people find out after years of knowing us that we are atheists, it doesn't matter. They don't care. And then they realize, like, oh, atheists are just like me. We're normal people. So that would be, I mean, that's like.
I have to say, we make it. It's one of our goals on our channel to try. We call our show "Mind the Gap" for several reasons. One of the reasons is that we want to close it as much as we can. Recently, I got suspended from Twitter. I still don't have a clue why. Twitter doesn't give me a reason. I don't only get automated responses, and I keep appealing. So maybe one day I'll know what actually happened and why I got suspended. So currently I'm on my backup, which is pretty much a clone of the original. What surprised me was, because I got suspended, all my accounts, so that includes the Mind the Gap account where I DM'd you, as my backup, got restricted for a week when my main account was suspended. So the only thing that I could do at that moment was DM, and I could only DM with people who were following me. And what surprised me was that I got as much Christians coming to me in DM asking me if there was anything they could do, if I wanted to get something out, they would retweet it for me, as I did atheists. So
sure,
that's something that I didn't expect, and I have to say, I'll have to give Charis a lot of credit, because Charis and I go back a long way. I think she was one of my first followers when I came on Twitter. And when we started talking, that I think that might be years later even. Yeah. She said she was running damage control for me on Twitter. Yep. When I demolished a Christian or was mean, Charis would go to that Christian and try to patch things up for the atheists. And I have to say, when we really started talking, at some point we started talking not only on in DM on Twitter, but we started talking in voice chats, and one of those is on our channel, in which Charis tells her story. I've learned so much that I couldn't possibly pick up in the Netherlands, because it's so different from the US. And I think I've changed my tune a little bit to the better, and become a lot more friendlier than I was before. But I still think it's important to build bridges, to let people know that you're not the enemy. Although this week I was called out for being the enemy from someone in Florida. I won't mention any names, but and that makes me sad, because sometimes you invest in people, and this went over a couple of years, and I thought, well, now we have a basis for something like a friendship. She started a YouTube channel, and I helped her with some of the stuff she couldn't do, and then suddenly become an atheist, become an enemy. That's something that I didn't expect.
Right.
Especially when our channel, our goal is to humanize the other side, because so many people are dehumanizing the other. They're othering the other. Here I'm doing it too. I'm saying the other.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to bridge that gap, mind the gap.
No, I think that's a great point, right? I mean, one of the things that I've always, that first book that I talked about, What You Know About Religion, I'm very much trying to say there's nuance in religion, right? Not all religious people are fanatics. The fanatics are the ones that concern me, but even the fanatics, I mean, I think that the part that is most disarming is many of them are really, really nice people, right? We think they're misguided. They're well-intentioned, but misguided, right? And I think they are nice people. We have to mind the gap. We have to cross that bridge and try and help them, right? Now, of course, they think they're doing the exact same thing with us, and so it gets complicated, and I understand that. But I don't think the goal should ever be to demonize, to attack, particularly violently, right? But it's to reach across and try and help people see where certain types of religion, not all religion, certain types of religion are actually very, very harmful, not just for individuals, but for societies, for entire groups of people. The evidence is overwhelming in that regard, right? And the crazy part is, like, you could easily point that out to a fundamentalist Christian. You could say, don't you think fundamentalist Islam, right? So not all Islam, but fundamentalist Islam, don't you think that that is harmful? And they would say, absolutely, that's harmful. But they can't see how fundamentalist Christianity is harmful. Right? And that's true for many of us. We have a hard time seeing how our personal worldview is harmful, but it absolutely can be.
Yeah, well, I have to say, the best conversation I ever had on Twitter was with a fundamentalist Christian, a Southern Baptist, if I'm completely correct. And because of the time difference, I started talking with him on Twitter in the open, and we had a very nice conversation. And I had to stay up all night. The conversation for me ended, I think, anywhere between 8 and 9 a.m. in the morning. So I spent all night talking to this guy, and that's when I found out that he was only 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
And I really was under the impression, because of the picture that he had up, that I was talking to an adult, because he was, well, like Aaron Ra, he was a big guy.
Sure.
And so his picture didn't show that he was that young. But that was one of the best conversations that I've ever had. No animosity at all. Trying to see each other's viewpoints. And so at the end of the conversation, he said, well, let's suppose you make it to the US and you get to visit me. He had told me in DM where he lived. He said, if I would ask you to come with me to church, would you do it? I said, yes, because I think in this conversation, at least you earned the respect. And I would accompany you. I would ask questions. I would take notes, and I would ask you about this after the service. But yes, I would absolutely accompany you to church. And so we still have been in touch off and on. He's gone off to college, so has a lot less time than he used to have, and isn't that often on Twitter anymore. But yeah, sometimes you just get meaningful conversations, and you actually get the chance to bridge the gap, because he told me that his church taught that atheists were of the devil. They were dangerous, and so he got a different view,
right?
And that stuck, and has stuck for at least now a couple of years. So. It is working, and it might be, maybe it's just a tiny ripple, but we have a couple of friends, all have different channels. Some talk about evolution, some talk about other science stuff. One of them, I don't know if you've heard of him, Apologia, does great stuff on debunking Ken Ham.
Probably.
He has a huge following, and actually the people of AIG follow his channel to see what he has to say.
He does the ham and eggs.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So, and I think all of these tiny ripples will make a wave at some point, and at least let people know that they're not only angry atheists out there. And I also see a little bit of a shift when I look at Matt Dillahunty and I look at Aaron Ra. I think they've mellowed a lot over the last few years in their approach. So, and I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm with a Christian, so I guess I've bridged the gap all right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I actually gave a presentation on my book, How to Defeat Religion in 10 Easy Steps, at a conference, a secular conference. And Matt Dillahunty was in the audience. He came up afterwards and was like, absolutely, right? Because one of the things I point out in that book is direct confrontation is rarely successful, right? Now, I don't mind having conversations. A conversation is fine, but debates, they're not going to convince many people. They will get occasionally somebody, right? But for the most part, they're not successful, because when you're debating, at some level, you're attacking, and our immediate response is to defend. So I think there are better, more strategic ways to kind of work with people, which is to do it subtly, right? To be good people is actually more effective than to attack people's religious beliefs. Don't get me wrong. I think there is a place for being critical, for kind of illustrating the problems. I think that's all absolutely valid. We need to do that. But I think it's often more effective to actually befriend people and help them see that we're not angry atheists. We're normal people living normal lives, just trying to make a go of it. And that helps them to see, like, oh, there is a way out, right? I was going to actually mention, when you were talking about how many Christian groups depict atheists as like really evil, right? Well, there's a reason why they so hate atheists, right? They can criticize other religions, and this is actually an analogy that comes from a buddy of mine who's also a sociologist of religion. He says, but when you've got a religion critiquing a religion, it's basically like they're attacking with a sword, but they also have a shield, right? So they're attacking, saying, oh, you did this wrong, you're wrong, but then the other person who's also religious can attack right back and say, well, you're based on faith too, and that's wrong as well. And his argument is that atheists don't have a shield. They have two swords, right? Because you can't really critique our position. Our position is fundamentally rooted in empiricism and reality, right? So when you attack an atheist, they just attack with two swords back. There's nothing that we have to defend with, because what are you going to criticize us on, right? They've tried with the happiness stuff. They've tried with the angry stuff. Those arguments fall flat. There's no evidence to support them. It's just like throwing out whatever they can, but we can just keep undercutting their arguments, right? It's an interesting analogy, I think.
Well, I mean, one problem is that the Bible explicitly states certain horrible traits of the godless. And if they're to disbelieve that, then they are implicitly going against what Scripture teaches, and kind of, in a way, admitting to a fault in Scripture, and that would be horrifying to them.
It wouldn't be the first time, though, right? I mean, there are many, many aspects for modern Christians, right? Many aspects of the Bible that they wholly reject. They would absolutely reject those. One of the things that I love doing in my classes, right? And I don't do this with an ill intention. I do it because I'm illustrating points, right? But I often will read from the Bible in my social religion classes where I do this, right? So I teach a class on the sociology of religion. And we'll be talking about something like gender, or maybe religion and violence, or whatever it is. And I'll just say, okay, well, what does the Bible say about this? And as I read certain passages, it blows their mind to realize what is actually in the Bible. And even the Christian students, which again, that class is not about changing beliefs or anything like that. Many of the Christian students will have never read those passages, and they
But
will.
you took that out of context.
I read the whole thing. I'll read as much as they want. I'll let them read it, right? Because I'm not taking it out of context. I let them read it. And when they do, they condemn those passages, right?
In fact, the context usually makes it worse.
Yeah, it's bad, right? So sometimes just letting them read their own book can be really telling.
I guess I'm just speaking mostly about the those with a more fundamentalist mindset, the perfection of Holy Scripture. You know, it's infallible. So if God says that we are A, B, C, D, and E, then if we act in a way that is contrary to that, then either we are putting on a show to disguise those characteristics in ourselves because we don't want them to know that we're a wolf in sheep's clothing, or God is working through us like he worked through Balaam's ass. For those who don't know, God is said to have inhabited a donkey for a short time or allowed the donkey to speak. And so used a donkey, and in the same way, God can use even an atheist for his means.
Yeah, it's classic confirmation bias, right? So they're finding ways to validate their beliefs and ignoring all the ways that their beliefs are not validated.
But for many of them, us being nice is a contradiction against Scripture.
Which is why it's so effective.
Yeah.
But you mentioned being kind and not attacking in the debates. I would agree that debates won't solve anything, because the winner of the debate is usually the one who's best at debating and not the one who has the better points. So I don't think that's useful at all. Right. I do think that having conversations like we do helps, because people have actually told me that the content that we makes them think.
Good.
And some have come to me, at least, and saying, well, I was working towards it. This and this just tipped me over the edge, and I now can say out loud that I'm an atheist. Mm-hmm. But a friend of mine just beat me to it, because I already had a confirmation for him to come on a channel, and he spoke with him, and I said, well, you go first and we'll go later. We'll host both conversations on our channel with Anthony Magnabusco. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's the guy who pretty much made street epistemology popular.
Oh, right. I know who you're talking about. Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what do you think of that approach?
Peter Bagassian? Like Peter Bagassian's street atheism stuff. I don't know this other guy as well, but Peter I do know. I mean, I think it depends on how you're doing it, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with having conversations with people. As soon as it crosses over into a debate, it's done. It's not generally going to be effective. And I know there are always exceptions, right? But I'm a statistician, right? Like at heart, I care about the rule, not the exceptions.
So having studied psychology as you have, can you explain to those who are listening why bringing just facts into a debate will not work with a person who believes otherwise?
Sure. So, I mean, I think facts matter at some level. I mean, like clearly they do. You have to have the facts, right? But most of us don't make most of our decisions based strictly on facts. Some do. Some do. Most of us are very emotional, right? We don't like to admit it. We're very good at rationalizing what we do after the fact. So whatever irrational thing we've actually done, we make it seem rational. But we are not rational creatures. We are fundamentally irrational in most of the things that we do. And this it goes into our psychology at certain levels. And I don't want to claim any expertise in neurology and kind of brain functioning, because that's not my area. But if we just look at human behavior, right, it's really hard to predict individual human behavior. We can predict group level behavior pretty good, because that tends to follow certain patterns. But what any individual is going to do in any given situation is virtually impossible to predict because we're not rational. The example that I love using is when we buy a car, right? We may pick a car, like the model and the make, based on some objective criteria that we care about, right? I haul stuff, I need a truck, or I want the best gas mileage, so I'm going to get a Prius or something like that. But what about the color of the car? Why do you pick the color that you pick? If you get to pick from any color, what would be the most rational color if we're thinking about showing dirt, right, and its ability to withstand the elements and things like that? We should all be driving brown cars, right? Like, it's just the most rational car. Nobody does. I mean, very few people do. Why do we pick the color that we do, right? It's based off of preference. And how can you argue at the end of the day that preference is logical? Preference is not objective fact, right? It's based on, I like that color, period.
I have to call guilty on this because I've been crazy about cars ever since I could talk. When I was 5 years old, I could name every make and model, and I could even distinguish cars in the dark by their taillights.
Wow.
So, yeah, I own a 73 Mustang Mach 1.
Mm-hmm.
I think that pretty much sums it up, how rational I am. Living in a country where I think gas is triple of what it costs in the US. It's not a rational decision. If I want to make a trip, I have to stop 3 times. When I from my house to Amsterdam, I have to stop 3 times to get gas, and when I go to Amsterdam and back, it'll take me 5 tanks of gas just for that single trip.
Yeah, I mean, props to you. I'm cool with cars, right? I'm not huge into cars, as I just use an example, but thank you for illustrating the point really, really well, right? Like, why we do these things. It's not rational. It's not.
No, it's pure emotion. This is pure emotion. I was I know when it was. I was 11 at the time, and a friend of my grandfather was a very famous singer, and his wife got a new car, which was a Mustang Mach 1. I think she started out with the 71 model, the 72, and the 73. And the 73 was the one that's stuck with me. So that was a car that I wanted to have from the time that I was 11, and I was 37 when I was able to buy one. So yeah, no rationality involved. I saved a lot of money to spend on pure emotion, and it's still costing a ton. even though
I'm not 37 yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You were buying a car before never mind. You know.
Yeah.
But that's to like why facts don't work in debates. I mean, they're necessary, right? So I'm not saying you don't have facts. You have the facts, you have them on your side. But if it's more effective actually when you're debating if you're funny, right? The person who's humorous and likable is actually more likely to win the debate regardless of the facts. And it's because that's emotional.
That also works when you look at what Anthony Magnabosco does. He is so non-threatening in his approach. He's kind. He's not asking threatening questions, but he is going at it from an emotional perspective. I think trying to make people think about something they hold dear. And that's difficult. And if you find a way to actually make them think about it, I think that would be the best way to let people see. Because now you're not telling them what to think, or you're not giving them any options. You're having them question their own beliefs and come up with maybe alternative options and maybe look at their own beliefs and look at things they haven't looked at before.
Sure. And again, I'm not going to criticize it. I think it's perfectly reasonable, but we also have to recognize, and this is going to sound very elitist. I apologize in advance. I'm not trying to be elitist in any real sense here, but again, the data do support this idea. A sizable percentage of people never question their beliefs. Lots of people don't like to think. Thinking is, and I don't mean that in a pejorative, like they're somehow inferior, right? People are different and people have different preferences, right? I happen to be of an intellectual bent and I like to think about things a lot. That doesn't make me better than anybody else. It doesn't make me worse than anybody else. It's just different, right? So it's a difference. I'm not implying anything pejorative about that. But there are a lot of people who don't like to think, right? So why should we go out of our way as non-believers to try and force people to think? Why should we do that, right?
For the coffee industry.
They will come find these questions, and then we can have the conversation. I think we need to have the conversation.
Do it for the coffee industry.
Do it for the coffee industry?
Yes.
How so, the coffee industry?
They'll have to drink coffee in order to think.
Yeah, well, I could agree with that, because I come from a completely different viewpoint, because I grew up as an atheist in an atheist country, in an atheist community, in a secular school where religion wasn't part of my life for the first 20 years, I think. The only thing that I had that was religious was when the wife of a friend died, and then I went to a religious service because she was a Catholic. He was an atheist, she was a Catholic, and she had a Catholic service. Mm-hmm. But that was it. And I never even thought about it, not even after that service, thought about it, if there was anything to it. So yeah, the not thinking part works both ways. It worked for me the same thing, because I never even, it didn't come up.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people that I've talked to that are from the US find it strange that God never came up as I was growing up. My parents never told me about religion, never told me that there were people who believed in a God. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can at least confirm that. But that brings me to an interesting question, which was thrown at me in DM. A follower of mine, Florida Line, read your blogs and picked out one thing. You said in one of your blogs that while you were still religious, and I don't know the exact wording anymore, you were kind of obnoxious and not a pretty good person. So can you shine a light on that for people that are listening? Is that something that you really see that way, and was that the result of religion, or what changed?
Yeah, I totally own that, right? I mean, I own that all the time, that when I was devoutly Mormon, right, one of the things that the religion taught and still retains as a teaching, right, is obviously we've got to follow certain commandments, if you will, certain rules and laws about righteous living. And so I did that. I was actually very devout. I was a very obedient Mormon, right? So I did a lot of those things. But when you extend that out, the next step to that is they will also say, don't surround yourself with bad influences. So if there is someone around you who is not following the commandments, the rules that we have set forward, you should remove yourself from them, right? Well, to do that, you basically have to judge people, right? You have to go around saying, you're not doing what God wants, I can't be around you. And it turns you into, and I hope it's okay to curse on here, I think I heard Charis say it, but it turns you into a self-righteous asshole, right? That you're constantly going around saying, nope, I can't be around you because you drink coffee, right? And as a Mormon, I couldn't do that. So drinking coffee, sin, you're out, right?
Yeah, it's considered a
You
drug.
are having sex outside of marriage. You are clearly sinful. That is a sin second only to murder. You are out. I cannot be around you, regardless of how nice these people might actually be, right? They may be the most wonderful, loving people on the planet, but because of this one thing that they're doing, they're out. I must cut them off. And I did that, right? For most of for all of my childhood up until my mid-20s, I was, and I openly admit this, a self-righteous asshole. That I did follow the rules, and I followed them very carefully because I believed them. That's what I've been taught. That's what I've been raised to believe. And I would cut people off. I had friends that I was like, nope, you're smoking marijuana. I cannot be around you. I never want to be around you ever again, despite this person being my childhood friend for 15 years. Smoked a joint, he's out, you're done, I cannot be around you anymore. So it led me to be something of a self-righteous asshole. And that largely ended when religion ended for me, right? Now, I'm not saying that I'm a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. I have all sorts of issues, right? Like we all do. But that one particular issue has changed. Now I don't look at somebody and I'm like, oh, you smoke. Like, oh man, like I can never be around you, right? Smoking is completely divorced from whether or not they're a good person. I could care less of whether or not somebody smokes, right? If that's what you want to do, fine. You can choose to do that. Are you an asshole? Like, that's my criteria for being okay with people. Do you treat people well? Are you nice to people? Can I be around you? Are you an asshole? If you're not an asshole, we're good. I don't care, right? Doesn't matter what you do, who you sleep with, anything about you. None of that matters to me. Are you an asshole? That's it, right? So I try not to have that self-righteous attitude anymore of, I just want to be around negative, kind of demeaning, angry people because they bring me down. So don't be an asshole around me and we're good. And that has been, I think, a direct result of leaving religion is I don't go around judging people in that way anymore.
Okay. Well, it's been a little over an hour and a half. I think we should wrap it up. It's been a very interesting talk, and I'm very happy that you came on our channel. I'll give you the last word. If we know that there are several theists following our channel, is there something you would like to say to the theists in general? Maybe a last message before we end the stream.
Sure. Kind of sprung me on that. But the first thought that comes to mind, right, is I would strongly encourage them to get to know atheists, right? And this research goes back 60, 70 years, right? The contact hypothesis that if you can get to know people at an egalitarian level, right? So these are people who are, there's not a power imbalance, right? That you're on the same level and you can get to know them. And it sounds awkward, like make a friend, right? But at some level, get to know these people. It's probably going to change your view on whether atheists can be good people, right? Now, you don't have to agree with them. I'm not saying that you have to change your minds. Like, honestly, I don't care. I don't care what people believe regarding a God. I don't care. That doesn't matter to me. It's, are you a good person? Do you treat people well, right? At the end of the day, I care way more about that than I care about whether or not people believe in a God. But if we're trying to bridge that gap, I think people do need to let down their guard a little bit and say, you know what, I'm going to reach across the aisle and I'm going to get to know some people who are non-believers. And hopefully the end result will be, even if we disagree on whether we believe in a God or aspects of scripture or whatever it is, that we can do so respectfully, that we can respect each other, that we don't treat each other poorly just because of certain characteristics that we might have.
I'd have to add in a slight caveat
Sure.
To the theist who maybe decides to go on this venture. Just be aware of the walls that might instantly go up if you do kind of broach that subject, because of widespread maltreatment in some pockets of the U.S. So it can get a little bit awkward or prickly. So just be prepared for it. Try to seem like you don't even notice it and put them at ease. Let them know you're not going to bite their head off.
Yes, and don't come out openly if you don't think it's safe for you at that moment.
Especially minors.
Because
don't do it.
Yes,
don't do it.
Yes. Last thing that I wanted to add is people can find you on the internet. So can you? Yes, you're on Twitter.
I am on Twitter. Yeah, you can just search for Ryan Cragun. It'll pop right up. I'll apologize. There is another Ryan Cragun. He's also an ex-Mormon. He's a computer programmer. Poor guy. He gets a lot of my email, right? So just like to check. I really do feel bad. He's actually a really nice guy. He's forwarded me emails in the past and stuff like that. But I'm pretty easy to find. If you Google Ryan Cragun, it'll pop right up. Either ryancragun.com or Ryan T. Cragun. They both go to the same place. You'll find my professional website. I'm on the University of Tampa's website, of course, and I'm on Twitter, and I am on Facebook. I think those are the main ones. I don't really do much anywhere else.
And we'll have some links to those below the video later.
Yeah. The only one I didn't have was the Facebook, because I have to admit I hate Facebook. I'm not made for Facebook. It doesn't agree with me. So, but if you can forward me all the links that you would like to have put in here, we'll put them in so people can find you, and I'll see that we can link to your books as well, so people know where to find those. And I want to thank you for a very interesting conversation. We had some people in the live chat who were very happy with the conversation. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining. Sure,
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye to all the people in the live chat. I think we might have a guest maybe this weekend again, so stay tuned. We'll tweet about it, and see you all next time. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and see you next time. Bye-bye.